Our story begins during the Caribou Gold Rush of the early 1860s. Two American brothers, Jerome and Thaddeus Harper, left their home in Virginia and headed west to chase gold. By 1862, the Harpers had arrived in British Columbia, trying their luck in the goldfields around Yale and living for a time in Victoria. They soon realized, however, that the real riches were not in panning for gold, but in providing beef to the hungry miners. At that time, cattle that cost about $10 a head in the United States could fetch over $100 a head in BC's booming gold camps. Sensing an opportunity, the Harpers pivoted from prospectors to cattlemen. In 1863, the Harper brothers drove a herd of cattle north from as far away as Oregon and Idaho to the Caribou goldfields. After several such cattle drives, they began looking for suitable ranch land. They struck an agreement with local Chilcotin First Nations people to divide use of the land near the Chilcotin and Fraser rivers, ensuring peace with their indigenous neighbors as they settled in the area. On the west side of the Fraser River, about 45 kilometers north of present-day Clinton, BC, the Harpers found a cattleman's paradise, rolling hills blanketed in nutritious bunchgrass as far as the eye could see. They staked a claim on 160 acres of benchland under Alkali Lake under a Crown grant, establishing the homestead that would grow into the Gang Ranch. The ranch's unusual name traces back to a piece of farm equipment. The Harpers used a large double-furrow plow called a gang plow to break the tough sod, reportedly the first time such a plow had been used in Canada. This labor-saving device made a strong impression. According to later accounts, the ranch got its name from that gang plow, a term also fitting for the sizable crew of men and horses needed to run such a huge outfit. By the late 1860s, the ranch's JH brand, formed from Jerome Harper's initials with the J and a sideways T linked to make an H, was registered with the colonial government and would become one of the best-known brands in the region. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, the Harper brothers expanded their range aggressively. They purchased and leased land not only around their home base west of Clinton, but also in outlying areas like Hat Creek and Kamloops. By 1883, the Harpers owned about 38,000 acres, 15,000 hectares, of deeded land, an enormous holding for the time. In addition, they secured grazing leases on vast tracts of Crown land. Thousands of cattle and horses grazed over this domain, making the Gang Ranch one of the world's largest ranching empires of the 19th century. Some later legends even claim the ranch controlled 4 million acres, though a more accurate figure for its peak grazing range is around 1 million acres, including Crown leases. The Harpers played a pivotal role in jump-starting BC's cattle industry. The Gold Rush beef trade proved so lucrative that it helped establish ranching as a cornerstone of the province's economy. Yet, even as their cattle business boomed, the Harpers learned that ranching on this raw frontier came with enormous challenges. The remote Chilcotin country dealt them harsh tests. Brutal winters periodically devastated the herds. In the winter of 1878, an exceptionally deep freeze and heavy snows caused thousands of cattle to perish on the range. Profits could vanish with the turn of the weather. They also faced wild price swings in the cattle market and the ever-present threat of cattle rustlers stealing stock in the vast backcountry. A local wag later noted that bad luck has dogged the remote Gang Ranch from the start, earning it a reputation for virtually destroying everyone who has owned it. For the Harpers, that prophecy proved tragically true in a personal sense as well. In 1867, the brothers founded a company called the Canadian Ranching Company to formalize their enterprise. But within a few years, fate struck both men in the form of horseback accidents. Jerome Harper, the elder brother and the shrewd financial mind of the pair, suffered a severe head injury when his horse bucked and kicked him in the head during a ride. He developed memory loss and signs of insanity from the trauma and had to leave the ranch. Jerome moved to San Francisco for medical care, but he never fully recovered. He died in 1874 as a result of his injury. His brother Thaddeus Harper carried on. But 10 years later, Thaddeus also met misfortune. In 1884, while riding in the remote backcountry, Thaddeus was thrown and stepped on by his horse. He lay unconscious for a full day before being found, and he suffered a fractured skull and broken jaw. Though Thaddeus survived, he was incapacitated for weeks and left deeply in debt from the expanding ranch operations and recent cattle losses. By the late 1880s, the writing was on the wall. Thaddeus Harper could no longer keep the business afloat financially. Cattle prices had fallen, debts piled up from years of expansion, and the sprawling ranch was cash-strapped. In 1891, Thaddeus made the difficult decision to sell the gang ranch. The era of the pioneer Harpers came to an end, closing a chapter of bold expansion tempered by cruel twists of fate. The Harper legacy, however, lived on, not only in the ranch's brand and lore, but also in the very name, Gang Ranch, which would continue to capture imaginations for generations. The new owner in 1891 was Thomas Galpin, an English businessman with an eye for opportunity. Galpin was a retired publisher from London, famous as a co-founder of the publishing house Cassell & Co., who was seeking ventures in the New World. He and some partners formed a British syndicate to take over the Harper holdings. Under Galpin's direction, the operation was soon restructured and by 1898 renamed the Western Canadian Ranching Company. Galpin set it up as a public company in London, hoping to attract ample British capital to develop the ranch. In fact, Galpin himself is credited with giving the spread its romantic new name, the Gang Ranch. The story goes that highlighting the use of that innovative gang plow on the ranch helped entice British investors by symbolizing progress and productivity. Throughout the late 1990s and early 1900s, the English era of the gang ranch saw significant investment in infrastructure and modernization. Galpin's sons-in-law and other relatives came to BC to manage the ranch on site. One of his key local managers, James Prentice, even married into Galpin's family and later became a prominent politician, which helped raise the WCRC's profile. The ranch headquarters grew into a small village of its own. Fences were built to partition pastures. Sawmills and workshops were established. Bridges over creeks were thrown up, and bunkhouses and cookhouses sprang up for the workers. They constructed roads and even built an irrigation dam around 1917 to irrigate the hay meadows, a major improvement that boosted feed production. With the help of local Chilcotin cowboys and ranch families, such as the Gaspard and Calalest families who settled in the area, the WCRC managed thousands of cattle across rugged terrain, grazing them in summer and feeding them through winters. Despite these advancements, running a ranch by remote control from London was challenging. The English shareholders were far away, and hired ranch managers, while competent, had little personal stake in the profits. Over the decades, the gang ranch under the WCRC often struggled to be truly profitable. The operation was costly to maintain in such a wild, isolated region, and it was a constant effort to develop the business. The ranch did remain a going concern through World War I and into the 1920s. Indeed, by the 1920s, it was still one of the preeminent ranches in Canada, rivaled only by outfits like the Douglas Lake Ranch farther south. But a series of calamities in the following decade nearly broke the enterprise. The 1929 stock market crash and the Great Depression hit the cattle industry hard. Beef prices plummeted. One source notes, heifer prices dropped to just 4 cents a pound in that era. At the same time, severe droughts and dust storms of the dirty 30s compounded the difficulties. The once abundant British capital dried up, and the WCRC's accumulated debt became unsustainable. By the mid-1940s, after roughly half a century of English ownership, the gang ranch was once again put up for sale. The era had left its mark. English influences could even be seen in the big ranch house, which was furnished with imported British furniture and amenities, a little touch of England on the BC range. But now a new chapter was about to begin, one that would prove both colorful and chaotic. In June 1947, 2 Americans showed up with a handshake and a lot of cash to buy the gang ranch. They were Floyd Skelly Skelton and Wild Bill Studdert, and their deal was sealed on the strength of nothing more than that handshake and a verbal agreement. The price was reportedly $800,000, a huge sum in 1947, reflecting the ranch's value even in a run-down state. Skelton was a cattleman from Montana, and Bill Studdert was an adventurer often described as a charming but hard-drinking cowboy with a flair for the dramatic. Their purchase marked only the third time the ranch had changed hands since its founding. Under Bill Studdart's part ownership, the ranch gained a certain notoriety. Bill was well connected to Western pop culture figures. Hollywood friends like singer Bing Crosby and actor Gary Cooper visited the gang ranch during his tenure. These social calls aside, however, Wild Bill proved to be a rather irresponsible steward of the ranch. Living up to his nickname, he earned local infamy for heavy drinking and neglectful management. Former ranch residents recall that ranch hands sometimes went unpaid and basic upkeep was ignored. Animal welfare issues soon arose. At one point, Studdart was even charged with cruelty to animals for starving and neglecting his cattle. He also dabbled in side hustles like operating an unlicensed hunting outfitting business on the property where guests illegally shot game such as moose out of season. Bill's antics included occasionally locking the only road into the vast backcountry, essentially sealing off the hinterlands of the ranch to everyone, including government officials. Not surprisingly, the authorities were frequently at odds with him, but enforcement in such a remote area was lax. Meanwhile, bills went unpaid. Local suppliers cut off credit when they realized no grub bill had been paid in a year, forcing ranch staff to slaughter cattle just to eat. This wild ride finally came to an end when Wild Bill Studdart died in 1971, still holding his stake in the gang ranch. His death set off a scramble over his share of the ranch. Half of Bill's interest passed to his two children. The other half he rather unwisely left to his nurse, who herself died intestate, without a will, not long after. The estate was hit with heavy death taxes, and eventually Bill's portion ended up with a distant relative. Co-owner Floyd Skelton, meanwhile, had stepped back from day-to-day operations. He had leased out the ranch in the late 1960s to an operator named Melvin Sidwell, and he tried to sell the ranch outright a few times as Studdart's health and the ranch's condition deteriorated. In the early 1970s, Skelton thought he had found a buyer in a Vancouver businessman who dreamed of turning part of the gang ranch into a tourist destination. That investor made a small down payment on an agreed price of $7.5 million and even started constructing a hotel on the property to launch a resort venture. For a brief moment, it appeared the gang ranch might pivot into the hospitality business. However, the deal collapsed before the hotel's roof was even completed due to the buyer defaulting and likely realizing the enormous costs of running such a ranch. By the mid-1970s, the gang ranch was left in limbo, under-maintained, in legal tangle from Studdart's estate, and still owned, at least partially, by Floyd Skelton, who was eager to find a way out.